I'm supposed to do lots of physical activity with my kids so I can instill in them a physical fitness habit so they'll grow up to be healthy adults. And I'm supposed to do all kinds of intellectual play so they'll grow up smart. And there are all kinds of play for finger dexterity, word games for reading success, large motor play, small motor play. I feel like I could devote my life to figuring out what to play with my kids. On top of that, I have to be a short order cook, preparing 2 or 3 meals at a time, because if I force my kids to choose between eating what's there or skipping a meal, they'll get an eating disorder. Well, I think anyone who's recently been a parent and has looked into the child-rearing manuals can sympathize with this frazzled mom. Now, here are some sobering facts about research on parenting. Most studies of parenting are useless. The studies that gave rise to all of this advice for mothers. Why are they useless? Because they don't control for heritability. They measure some behavior in the parents, they measure some trait in the children, they show there's a correlation, and they assume that correlation implies causation. It must have been the parenting behavior that shaped the child in that manner. Much of this research doesn't even test the possibility that parents transmit genes to their children as well as an environment. And so, for example, the fact that parents who talk more to their children have kids with better language skills, or parents who spank their children have children who grow up to be violent, may come because there are genes that predispose children to being more articulate or more violent. There are studies that do control for inheritance. For example, retesting for the correlations in adopted children who do get parenting experience from their parents, but not their genes. And here are the 2 findings that turn up over and over again in study after study. One of them is that siblings separated at birth end up as similar as siblings reared together. Now, remember the Malafert twins. Separated at birth, they bump into each other at the patent office with identical contraptions in their lap. Okay, that's one discovery, but that's not the one that I'm talking about here. A second discovery from that research, which is less well appreciated, but equally important, is that if the Malafert twins had grown up together in the same house with the same parents, they would have been no more similar than they would have been if they had been separated. Similarly, for biological siblings, those who are separated and brought up in different homes are no more different than those brought up in the same home. Corroborating that set of studies are ones that look at similarities among adopted siblings who don't share genes but do share an environment, and find that they're not similar at all in adulthood, in personality or intelligence. They are no more correlated than pairs of people plucked off the street at random. Well, what are the implications? The implications are that the intellect and personalities of children are shaped not by parents, but by a combination of factors, in part, although only in part, by genes, in part by the surrounding culture, both the culture of the society as a whole and the children's own culture, which we call a peer group, and in part by chance events in the wiring of the brain in utero in the first few years of life, and perhaps chance experience. Now, I found that when people hear these results, which were first brought to public attention by Judith Rich Harris in her book, The Nurture Assumption, they often have the following reaction. So you're saying it doesn't matter how I treat my children. Now, it may be a natural reaction at first, but think about it. Of course it matters how you treat your children. It's never okay to abuse or belittle or neglect children, because that's a terrible thing for a big, strong person to do to a small, helpless one who is under that person's care. Child rearing, above all, is a moral responsibility. Also, let's say someone told you that you can't shape the personality of your spouse. Now, no one but a newlywed really believes that you can change the personality of your spouse. Nonetheless, on hearing this bit of wisdom, no one says, oh, so you're saying it doesn't matter how I treat my spouse. Well, of course it matters how you treat your spouse. It matters to the quality of the relationship that you have and the degree of pleasure and respect and depth that your relationship will enjoy. Likewise, parenting is a human relationship between two people, one of whom is a parent, one of whom is a child, and how the parent treated the child in childhood is going to affect the quality of that relationship. And I think it's a sign of the influence of the blank slate that so many people could forget this simple truth, or at least when intellectualizing they can forget it, and think of parenting only as the molding or micromanaging of a child's personality, whereas in fact it's much more than that. Let me more quickly go over the remaining two fears. The fear of determinism in the old philosophy sense is the opposite of free will, runs as follows. If behavior is caused by a person's biology, he can't be held responsible for it. And in fact, the fear is not totally groundless. Here's a headline that I clipped out of the Wall Street Journal a number of years ago. Man's genes made him kill, his lawyers claim. Honest. You can insert your favorite lawyer joke here. Now, by the way, the defense was not successful. This man's genes did not get him off the hook, but there's a clear fear that in the future we have to worry about this. Well, the reason the defense didn't work is, I think, fairly obvious. It comes from the old saying, to understand is not to forgive. Standards of responsibility, credit, blame, reward, punishment, are themselves causes of behavior. These standards don't have to appeal to a ghost or an immaterial soul, but rather to certain parts of the brain, presumably concentrated in the prefrontal lobes, that can inhibit behavior. We can retain this influence on the brain systems for inhibition, namely holding people responsible, even as we come to understand the brain systems for temptation. Also, the bogus defenses for bad behavior that have made the news from our judicial system are in fact more likely to be environmental than biological anyway. They include the abuse excuse with which the Menendez brothers got off the hook in their first trial by saying that the reason that they had to kill their parents is that they abused them when they were children. The black rage syndrome that the radical lawyer William Kunstler proposed as a defense of the Long Island Railroad gunman who began shooting passengers at random. It was because of the stress of living in a racist society. The patriarchy made me do it defense that some lawyers have used to try to get rapists off the hook, that they were inflamed by pornographic images in a misogynistic society. And perhaps the best example comes from West Side Story, in which the juvenile delinquents tell the local police sergeant, "Dear kindly Sergeant Krupke, you gotta understand, it's just our bringing up key that gets us out of hand. Our mothers all are junkies, our fathers all are drunks. Golly, Moses, naturally we're punks." The final fear is the most nebulous. It's the fear of nihilism. The idea that biology strips life of all meaning and purpose. It says that love, beauty, and morality are just figments of a brain pursuing selfish evolutionary strategies. And a nice illustration of this fear comes from the following comic strip, in which our hero, Arlo, is pacing the floors late at night, unable to sleep, racked with doubt. He says to his son, "Why am I here?" And the boy says, "To pass on your genes." "You still here?" Admittedly, most people are not satisfied with this answer to the question. Now, I have to add that this is not just, although it's often a fear expressed by people with certain religious beliefs, it's not just a religious worry, but it's a secular worry as well. But I'll discuss the religious version of this fear and the secular version separately. The religious version runs more or less as follows, that people need to believe in a soul which seeks to fulfill God's purpose and is rewarded or punished in an afterlife. Now, I want to make it clear that I don't intend to argue that against religion, or that people should not be religious, or that there's necessarily an incompatibility between religion and science. There are a number of brilliant neurobiologists and evolutionary biologists who believe that there's nothing incompatible between Darwin's theory of evolution, or the belief that the mind is completely a product of the brain, and some kind of belief in a supreme being. And I don't want to take on that debate. My goal is more defensive. I want to argue against the position that only religion is can be the source of our moral values. And here's why, in particular, the belief in an immaterial soul and an afterlife. And here's the response to that accusation from religion. First of all, I don't see anything so ennobling about a belief in a life to come, because it necessarily devalues life on earth. And think about what we conclude when we remind ourselves that life is short, or what we do. We renew a friendship. We bury the hatchet in a silly dispute. We offer a gesture of affection. We vow not to squander our time and to use it wisely.